Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 10. The Dimmons did not stay for supper, with the exception of Anthony, but Hannibal suffered through it all the same. Mrs. Pims, ready to either kill someone or drop into a dead faint from all the disruptions to her service, delivered them a delightful supper that the Duke made much over in order to keep the atmosphere light. Will, despite Anthony's insistent chatter and determination to engage him, remained silent and thoughtful in his place across from Hannibal, only leveling the occasional dangerous glare at his husband when Hannibal chanced to remark on Anthony's persistent attention. Hannibal was glad to see his cousin go back to Fernhill, damn him, and was oddly disappointed when Will excused himself from a nightcap in the white drawing-room with himself and the Duke.
"Does he often do that?"
Hannibal asked, frowning at the empty doorway where Will had softly bidden them both good night.
"Leave rooms?" the Duke asked, smirking. "Yes, quite as we often all do, I'm afraid. He's rather limited by his circumstances in that respect, bless him."
"You're certainly in good form," Hannibal observed.
"No."
"I mean, does he often excuse himself from company?"
"He is not often in company. These past 6 years he has been as a stranger to me, no matter my attempts to engage him. He has his quiet hobbies, fishing, his work here. He is content as he can manage, but he keeps very much to himself unless I can ask after him particularly. There have been whole weeks have gone by in which I have not seen him. Half the time even the servants have no idea where he's off to."
"That is rather cunning of him," Hannibal said, annoyed by how guilty that made him feel. Will's time here had not gone at all as he'd imagined.
"Only you would see it as such, Hannibal," the Duke sighed. "He is a gentle, intelligent, and quiet young man, and would suit you quite well if you would but allow it."
Hannibal frowned at that, peering into his glass as if it might offer some insight.
"Why is this the first I'm hearing of your interest in Will's family?"
he asked, swirling the liquor around before taking a swallow, cutting a sly look towards his grandfather.
"It was all long before you arrived here at Hartford House,"
the Duke said, somber, poignant sadness draining the weight of his years from his lined and weary face.
"The last time Charles and I had any exchange of depth was shortly after your birth. In fact, it was then that we drew up the contract between our families."
Hannibal arched a brow at that. My, aren't we feeling rather vague on details?"
"We may be as vague as we like, as we are old and lament the loss of our youth."
"Which this Charles was a large part of, I take it. Perhaps I should ask Aunt Margaret," Hannibal asked, willing to risk his grandfather's scowl. "She seems to know a bit more than you're willing to tell me. 'Tis strange to be so close to someone and never speak of them."
"There are things in this world we love that are too precious, too dear to us to parse down into words, Hannibal,"
the Duke said, the weighty sadness in his voice surprising his grandson.
"Suffice to say, age descended on him much sooner and much more viciously than it has on me. My only regret is that I was not with him when he passed."
It made Hannibal curious about this man he'd never heard of, this man who had been so dear to his grandfather. He wanted to ask more, but it obviously distressed him, and grandfather seemed so fragile in that moment that Hannibal didn't dare.
"And on that note,"
the Duke said, putting his unfinished drink down with a hand that trembled slightly,
"I am going to bed. We have a party to attend soon, and we all need our rest."
Hannibal bid him good night and finished his drink. Feeling restless and at loose ends, he abandoned the drawing-room for the library, glad to see that a few lamps were lit and casting a cozy, warm glow over the plush surroundings. Will saw his husband come in and close the door behind him, and wished he'd taken the book upstairs. He was moving just as Hannibal swung back towards him, and both of them froze, momentarily startled into stillness when they came face to face.
"I apologize, Lord Clarges,"
Will said, taking note of the page and closing the book carefully. "I had not considered you might come."
"Why should you? You have your own habits after all,"
Hannibal said, recovering quickly. He squared his shoulders and moved to take the chair opposite Will, lifting his hand in a staying gesture when Will made as if to leave.
"Please stay where you are."
Will subsided into the comfortable chair, his book in his lap, thumb idly running over the spine as Hannibal settled before him. Will looked to one side, ignoring the easy way Hannibal sat with his booted ankle crossed atop his opposite knee, and his arms loose on the armrests in the spread-open habit of an alpha used to taking up space. Will himself felt much smaller by comparison, sitting as he did with legs crossed at his ankles and his arms in his lap, making himself a smaller target from force of habit. Hannibal considered Will's delicate profile, the nub of his nose and the fullness of his mouth above the soft curve of his chin. He was not so small as his delicacy had first rendered him. He was just trim and spare in his movements, with a tendency to hold his posture in tight, stiff control. His ear peeked out from thick locks of his curls, a flash of pale skin against hair that was so dark brown it was nearly black in the faint light. He was quite a beautiful man, as Hannibal was forced once more to admit to himself. Comely enough to argue the point with stranger, no less.
"You were very quiet at dinner this evening,"
Hannibal said, his frown fearsome when he recalled how Anthony had pandered to Will at the table, grinning and easy with him in ways in which Hannibal himself could not manage.
"I had nothing of interest to share,"
Will said, wishing him away. Hannibal's mouth quirked in a smile, and he said,
"I doubt that very much."
Will was startled into looking at him, a furtive flash of blue eyes wide with surprise that died quickly under the weight of suspicion.
"Has my grandfather ever discussed with you the nature of his connection to your family?"
Hannibal asked, his amber eyes tracing the curve of Will's jaw when he turned his head away again. There was a stubborn set to his chin that suited him, feeding up into his full lower lip the way it did. When Will's mouth parted for him to speak, Hannibal startled a little, aware that he'd been staring.
"I have never heard of a connection between our families until today,"
Will said, feeling Hannibal's gaze almost like a physical touch.
"I'd no idea our grandfathers ever kept company, nor did my father, not that he ever admitted to.
Mr. Stammett's arrival with that contract was quite a shock for him."
"I admit to being unreasonably curious at any given time,"
Hannibal said, his scrutiny falling to Will's hands and long fingers, which had played the harpsichord with sensitivity and grace. Almost as an afterthought, he added,
"Grandfather is being cagey."
"It is his own business," Will said, curling his fingers around the book in his lap to allay Hannibal's gaze. "If he does not wish to share it, then he has no obligation to."
"Aren't you the least bit intrigued by it?"
Hannibal pressed.
"The fact that our grandfathers were close? I'd imagined there was some type of monetary or land alliance they sought in producing that damned contract, but it would appear to be something else entirely."
"There are many things in life that are quite different than they appear to be, Lord Clarges," Will reminded him. An unexpected smile curved his generous mouth when he said, "And your grandfather can be very determined in some things."
"You needn't tell me that,"
Hannibal said, irritably thinking of the stubborn old alpha who had maneuvered him with the effortless talent of long expertise. Will's glance lingered into a look, assessing. His voice was soft and almost vague when he said, "He has you twisted into an untenable position and set you at odds with yourself. How terribly frustrating that must be, Lord Clarges." Hannibal shifted with his sudden scrutiny, surprised to hear him speak so.
"You show surprising insight, Will. It is unusual to find it in one so young."
"I am merely what my nature dictates, Lord Clarges," Will said, his nerves putting a bite in his words as his father's rebuke came to mind. Nonsense, he'd always called it. Something to be dampened down lest it offend those around him. Recognizing Will was on the offensive, Hannibal gruffly reminded him, "Do try call me by name." "We are not well enough acquainted for that, I think," Will said, shaking off the momentary haze of his perception. He realized Hannibal was looking back at him and directed his attention back to the Turkish carpet, which Hannibal had threatened him with earlier.
"I am your—"
Hannibal broke off before he could finish, remembering how well the declaration had gone in his grandfather's suite this afternoon.
"There are documents that say otherwise."
"Documents do not make people acquainted nor contented with one another," Will said, tightening his grip on his book with every intention to get up and leave. "Please excuse me. I have no wish to do battle with you again today."
"Sit down,"
Hannibal said, aggravated by the way Will continuously attempted to quit whatever room he happened to find the two of them sharing. It put an unexpected alpha bark in the words that made his spouse stiffen with offense. Will stood from sheer stubborn defiance, shoulders stiff and straight. "I will not, and you had best not test me, Lord Clarges. I have no intention of becoming any more familiar with the carpets of Hartford House than I am just now." Hannibal almost smiled at the bravado, thinking him rather foolishly brave in attempting to pit himself against a stronger and altogether bigger man. The smile was mitigated, however, by the reminder that Will, despite his smaller frame, had very nearly thrown him off in the foyer and had done a damned good job of retaliating when concerned.
"Have you a trout hidden on your person?"
he asked, chuckling at how visibly irritated his little mate was.
"Or perhaps a teacup? It is unwise to talk bravely when you are unarmed."
"I have my mind, Lord Clarges," Will said, the sharpness of his voice shredding Hannibal's momentary belief that he could be predictable in the least. "I am never unarmed." Hannibal had to concede the point.
"Yes, you are a frighteningly intelligent little thing,"
he said, watching the minute play of expressions on his spouse's expressive face. "Little thing?" Will bristled, tilting his head to one side, amazed at him. "Can you actually hear yourself speak, or is the sound drowned out by the noise of self-admiration?" It was Hannibal's turn to gain his feet, admiring the fact that Will didn't budge an inch. He was certainly a determined and angry bit of fluffy curls when he was properly riled, and shockingly easy to move to defensive violence.
"Have you any other nasty observations to make of my character,
Hannibal asked, just to see what he would do, knowing very well he was risking having that book in Will's hand flung at his head.
"Considering you know me so well."
"I needn't know you well to know how well you think of yourself," Will said, meeting his stare with a steely one of his own. "You do as you please, Lord Clarges, and your actions speak to your own character." Hannibal laughed at that one, the situation having shifted to hostility so quickly that he couldn't quite pinpoint where he'd gone wrong.
"We are speaking of actions now, Will, because I have many questions on that count."
Will said nothing, just wrapped his arms around himself in a dismal, unconscious act of self-soothing, the book wedged tightly to his chest.
"Ever since my return, I've been piecing together a very strange picture of your time here. Your pathetic excuse for a monk's wardrobe, your absence from proper company, your taking on the land agent's work, your insistence on being called by your birth name. Makes me wonder what you hoped to accomplish."
Will paled at his tone, as if Hannibal found it all a staggering bunch of allegations that summed up into vicious intent.
"Did you have some goal in mind, Will, that I might someday yet return?"
Hannibal asked, feeling entirely ungenerous with him after the events of the day.
"Were you hoping your pious acts would compel me to overlook a marriage I neither wanted nor asked for? An undesired and repellent marriage I was forced into without so much as a warning?"
For a triumphant moment he thought that Will might fight back, might show that amazing temper of his. Instead, Will just quietly asked, "What did you expect I would do when you made a public mockery of me by packing your bags and leaving your ancestral home rather than spend one more moment in my presence?" A faint tremor of pain coursed through him when Will thought of that awful day and what had followed with such devastating rapidity. He felt sweat break out over his brow and upper lip, a flush of pink in his cheeks telling to the spike in his temperature. "You are public property, Lord Clarges. When you so much as sneeze, it makes the papers. You stamped me with your disapproval for all to see, like a heifer with a brand. I was not welcome anywhere by anyone. Did you think I was here in your absence throwing parties, purchasing myself a new wardrobe every season, making calls and entertaining myself on your coin?" Hannibal frowned, unwilling to admit that he had imagined just that, his brainless and encumbering spouse frittering away a fortune in gleeful ignorance of what happened in the world around him. "No one would attend any event I held. They wouldn't dare risk your ire in doing so," Will said, closing his eyes against an unsettling roll of nausea, suddenly far too warm. "No one would see the state of my clothing, because no one would step foot in this house to be tainted by your distaste. No one would accept a call from me, Lord Clarges, and share my ostracism from society. Was that not precisely what you'd hoped for? To isolate me into repentance for my sins?" The tremor spread to his voice, a wavering he could not even now control, and cursed himself for. "Well, I repented, Hannibal," he said, his arms dropping as he abandoned any attempt to soothe himself, hardening himself to the task at hand as he had throughout the entirety of his life. "I have made myself as absent from this house as I could under the circumstances, given that your grandfather would not allow me to go back to my father. And you have the audacity to scold me for it?" He lifted his head, blue eyes sheened with tears, but blazing, finally blazing with his powerful, awe-inspiring temper. "I had no choice but to use my own name, as if I could even be persuaded to take yours," he said, fingers clutching so hard on his book that knuckles burned white. "I had no choice but to take the position of estate manager and make amends to your grandfather, somehow to be useful. The people here accepted me, Lord Clarges. They invited me into their homes, they shared their worries and triumphs with me, and in the course of a single day you took all of that away from me." He took a deep breath, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. Hannibal's amber eyes stayed steadily on him, unflinching and unmoved. The same eyes that had looked at him with loathing that day Will had bonded to him. The same eyes that had stared impassively at his vulnerable, nearly naked body before he'd ordered Will out of his presence. "But I suppose that is little enough compared to what I stole from you," Will said, his anger leeching away to leave him numb, the warmth dissipating from his skin. "I am a thief, Hannibal, as you have so pointedly said in the past. I've no right to live in this house or claim your name. Indeed, I have no desire to burden myself with the name of a man who has so little respect for me or others like me." Hannibal could see him trembling, but it wasn't from fear. Not any more. "But it doesn't change the fact that Hartford House belongs to me. Dragging it from the brink of ruin, making it prosper, that is what I'd hoped to accomplish." Hannibal frowned slightly, his conscience twinging in a way that was becoming increasingly and concerningly more often, now that he had come home. His thoughts over the past 6 years in regards to the Omega left behind him, when he could be bothered to think of Will at all, had been anything but kind. The consequences of his actions would in no way make this easier on either himself or on Will, he knew. After a long, pregnant silence, Hannibal softly said, "Well, it seems you have an uncanny ability to render me speechless, Will." Will turned his back to Hannibal, ashamed to have lost control of himself. He felt ill somehow, too warm and sickened, easily driven to violence or upset by his husband. He longed for the numbness that had engulfed him 6 years ago, and kept him insulated from this awful excess of emotion. Retreating into icy reserve, he said, "You removed yourself once from an undesirable and repellent marriage to an undesirable and repellent Omega, Hannibal. I expect you to do so again, as we should all exercise those actions at which we excel." He did not slam the door when he left, much to Hannibal's surprise. He could not, even in that, be counted on to be usual, it would seem. Hannibal exhaled deeply, frustrated, wondering why his usual easy charm always abandoned him to bad temper when he was near Will Graham. It took Will a very long time to shake off Hannibal's influence after their clash in the library. His irritation was like a furnace inside of him, newly discovered at Hannibal's arrival and slowly heating him from the inside out. He was overwarm and irritable, confounded and hurt and angry all at once. In such a flux of emotions it was little wonder his skin felt too tight and hot to suit him. When he finally did sleep, it was plagued with nightmares of his father, deep dread, and the phantom of that cliff. He woke up still irritated, an unusual enough occurrence for him that Jimmy remarked on it, arching a blonde brow in that way he had which inevitably coaxed a smile from his young lord. "I see your run-ins with Lord Clarges are bearing fruit," he said, flinging his way into Will's dressing room to pick through his clothing. After 3 years of insisting Jimmy not rise so early to assist him, Will had finally given in to his pleasant, dedicated valet's insistence on doing just that. Though not the right fruit he might have an eye for. "There is little chance for that particular fruit," Will said, shoving away the comfort of sleep and standing in the chill air simply because he did not want to. Even so small a concession could breed catastrophic consequences, he knew, and hurtle him down the road to becoming precisely as Hannibal imagined he was. So he shivered and clenched his jaw and indulged in a little well-earned spite. "I am sure he will realize we suit no better now than we did 6 years ago, and rush back to his real family." "Mr. Graham, I have a plethora of opinions on that subject if you'd like to hear," Jimmy offered, his voice echoing from the empty depths of the dressing room. "No, Jimmy, thank you. I've had quite enough of opinions lately. I should go to the office." "The Duke would prefer you didn't," Jimmy said, poking his head out to give him a steady look. "Work and wait," he said. "You've got a party to attend soon, Mr. Graham, remember?" Will sighed, pacing slightly, toes curling against the cold nap of the hand-woven rug. "I do wish you'd let me have the girls lay a fire." "No, Jimmy, it's far too early to bother them, and I don't need coddling," Will said, but he didn't resist when Jimmy draped his dressing gown over his shoulders before returning to Will's closet. "What are you doing in there, anyway?" "Inventory!" "The Duke wants an inventory of my clothing." "No, I do." Will jumped a little when Hannibal suddenly spoke from behind him and turned around to find him standing in the open doorway to their shared washroom, still in his own nightclothes and robe. His hair was tousled, which peeled a few years off of him, reminding Will quite painfully that Hannibal was not so old as all that, in fact. "I beg your pardon, Lord Clarges, but once more you have wandered into places where you do not belong," Will said, resisting the urge to pat his own wild curls flat. There was simply no taming them without a good deal of water and a heavy comb, however, and he well knew it. "Shall I have Jimmy label the doors for you? I will insist he use very large print so you may read it." "Ah, yes, please do," Hannibal said, smirking and rather pleased he was so sassy so early in the morning when most people didn't have their wits about them, "as I am clearly suffering from infirmity of age." "Believe me, my lord, we are all suffering from your infirmity of age," Will said, annoyed and aware that he was en déshabillé, though he knew well enough how little impact that would make on Hannibal, considering what had happened during his ill-conceived seduction. "Is there any hour of the day in which you are pleasant?" Hannibal asked, making no move to quit the room or venture further in. "Whatever hour of the day, I am not in your presence, I fear." Hannibal closed his eyes and slowly took a deep breath, reminding himself that Omegas were delicate, frail creatures without the ability or motivation to save themselves, and that Will Graham was certainly none of those things, and he should no more want to throttle his mate than he should want to choke a child. But gods, was it tempting sometimes, even if Will quite reasonably would react with violence. "Behave," he warned, pleased when Will merely glowered at him. "I am in no mood to spar with you this morning, Will Graham. You there, Jimmy, what is the result?" Jimmy promptly emerged and handed Hannibal the list he'd made, which was dreadfully short and appalling. "I see," Hannibal said, reading it by the light of the taper Jimmy politely held for him. "And have you some aversion to clothing I am not aware of, Will? You have astonishingly little, considering." "Considering what, Lord Clarges?" "Oh, no, you don't," Hannibal said, pinning him with a firm look. "Contain that tongue of yours, Will, or I'll find better uses for it." Will's brows furrowed with confusion, and then he blushed, which Hannibal took gleeful note of, even if it was more angry than embarrassed. "So there's a way to curb your surliness after all," he said, returning to the list. "This is all of it, even from storage?" "Every bit of it, my lord," Jimmy said. "And it's all funeral garb?" Mr. Graham's not particularly fond of colour," Jimmy said, hedging his answer. "I have no use for such frivolous nonsense, and you have no cause to be inquiring into the state of my wardrobe." "I have, I do, and I will," Hannibal said, arrogant and short with him.
"We are attending an event at Fernhill, in case you have forgotten, and grandfather hopes to allay some of the gossips that apparently abounds in regards to us. Your dressing like an undertaker will not further our cause."
"I have no wish for your charity, Lord Clarges," Will said, clutching his robe up around his throat, aware of the weight of Hannibal's eyes when they landed there, searching and attentive. "And no need of your interest. My wardrobe will suffice."
"Unless you are being buried, Will, it will not. You will dress and meet me downstairs. We are going into the village. I am sure Mr. Avery can accommodate you."
"Would it not be more true to form, Lord Clarges?" Will said, his voice sweet enough that Hannibal was immediately on guard. "If I wheedle you?"
"You have my permission to revel in the flow of my generosity,"
Hannibal said, disapproving of his beliefs being tossed in his face with such accuracy. "How delightful that my plan to access a fortune I have had no hand in amassing is coming together so easily," Will said, glowering and equally annoyed. Hannibal leveled a glare at him, and Will stretched just a bit taller, refusing to bend.
"Perhaps I should stop at the tack shop while we are there, and purchase you a muzzle."
Will pointed at the door and said, "Out! Don't think I can't lift that table, and don't think I won't." Hannibal smirked, knowing for it was an empty threat, but left all the same, wondering why Will's prickly nature was so amusing. He certainly was an abrupt and surprising young man. Hannibal looked forward to seeing Will in polite society, and wondered just how his odd little spouse would handle all those irritating people who had snubbed him for 6 years. Will was dressed and downstairs before Hannibal himself, standing stiff and straight, staring off into space as if occupied by his thoughts. He cut a striking figure there in the early morning light, slender and composed. Hannibal strained to recall how Will had looked on the day he'd first arrived to Hartford House. Smallish, he thought. Rather, very small, young, and not yet into his full growth. He'd seemed childlike to Hannibal then, a reed-thin but softly rounded bundle of nervous responses keyed too tightly to Hannibal's alpha draw. He'd been too young then, yet Hannibal had not treated him with the kindness and understanding his extreme youth had required. And before him stood the result. A solemn and reserved youth who avoided looking him in the face at all costs when not exploding into impressive and delightfully uninhibited violence.
"Agonizing over a day's work left unfinished, are we, Land Agent Graham?"
Hannibal remarked, noting how Will started just a little, taken by surprise by his arrival. "Hartford House requires the full of my attention," Will said, managing to slide out of his reach as Hannibal gained the entryway and headed for the door.
"You were eager enough to leave it for Marsham Heath,"
he said, nodding to Mr. Hawkes, who swept open the door for them. "You said you are here to stay," Will said, following him out into the dim morning light. "I assumed you would take over running the estate, or else hire someone in."
"I do intend to hire someone. I also intend for you to have your hands full quite soon."
He glanced back at Will, who looked troubled and thoughtful. Smug, Hannibal descended the stairs to where a groom waited with their horses. He mounted, settling into the saddle to watch Will, who pulled up with easy, unconscious grace to sit erect in the saddle, his shoulders straight and squared.
"Walk on,"
Hannibal urged, clucking to his stallion, Will's own mount falling into place next to him. The morning sun grew stronger, chasing away the clouds. Hannibal tipped his nose to the soft breeze, enjoying the tang of country air that flooded his senses with so many different and wonderful scents. "This isn't necessary," Will said, breaking the long silence between them.
"Of course it is. You have had no proper exposure as a member of the Lecter family, and it is important for them to understand your true position here."
"Don't be ridiculous. This isn't about my position here," Will said, exhaling a weary sigh. "Mitigating the damage starts now, doesn't it? Your intentions are transparent, Lord Clarges. How better to begin mending the holes you have poked in my reputation than to be seen indulging me in town?" Hannibal glanced over at him, amused by the serious scowl on Will's lovely face.
"You are amazingly perceptive at times."
"Not really," Will said, eyes flicking up to his. "As I said, your intentions are transparent. A child would know what you're about."
"Don't sound so grateful."
"I have no reason to be. Will said, looking away again, swaying with the movement of his mare's gait. "It is merely an excuse to rub my nose in it at any provocation."
"Were you less provocative, it might not be a problem,"
Hannibal said, urging his horse into a canter. Will's mare broke into a trot to match, keeping pace. "You—" Will cut off sharply, scrabbling at the reins as his saddle slid sideways and broke free, tumbling him to the paved road where he landed with a sickening thud that stole his breath. Momentarily stunned, he just lay there, trying to sort out if he had been hurt or not. Hannibal reined up short, cursing, and turned his mount around to see Will sitting up in the road, dazed and bewildered. A sudden throb of panic blossomed in his belly at the sight of his spouse there in the lane, wincing with pain in the tangle of his saddle.
"Will!"
He drew his horse to a stop before him and hastily dismounted, concerned that Will might have been badly hurt in his fall. He was uncertain what had happened to send him toppling from the horse. He was an excellent horseman, Hannibal knew, and was not prone to clumsiness. "I'm fine. I just got the wind knocked out of me," Will said, the mare tugging at the rein he still clutched in one tight fist. "She must have blown out her belly. She sometimes does. I should have saddled her myself." Hannibal caught his scent, the faint sweetness tinged with acrid pain, and traces of something he could not name.
"Have you any sharp pains, Will?"
Will shook his head hesitantly, his leg and hip aching where he'd fallen. He hadn't been able to free his foot from his stirrup before he'd hit the ground, and lay in a heap with the saddle tangling him up. Hannibal bent and helped sort him free, frowning because Will was in pain, and he could tell, even if the little twit wouldn't admit it.
"Here,"
Hannibal said, focusing on checking his limbs. Will flushed and batted at him with one hand, appalled to have Hannibal's hands roaming all over him, gently squeezing to feel the bones beneath as he checked for breaks.
"Will you stop flailing about? I'm a doctor, Will, I need remind you."
"I told you I'm fine," Will said, unsure what to make of his concern. "I'm fine." Will blushed to the tips of his ears when his assurances made no dent in Hannibal's examination. Indeed, he seemed so focused on what he was doing that Will just watched him, seeing the man who had tended the wounded in a war far from their own shores. It made him wonder how many had died, despite Hannibal's best efforts, how many lives he felt responsible for in his near decade overseas. He could see the grim intensity on Hannibal's handsome face and wondered if he, too, was thinking of those soldiers he had tended and lost. "It is not the lives you saved that you remember, is it?" Will breathed, and Hannibal's startled amber eyes met his. Will immediately dropped his gaze to one side, tamping down his gift, his father's warning still fresh all these years later. It seemed to bubble up helplessly in Hannibal's presence, more troubling to him in the past few days than it had been in 6 years. Hannibal's gaze sketched over Will's stubborn profile, but his little mate gave him nothing more than that sharply perceptive observation. "No," he said, his professional reserve fading along with the grim memory of those he had failed in the war. "It is those who are lost which I remember most clearly." It escaped him how Will would have any knowledge whatsoever about his experiences, nor did it make sense to him how Will could have hit on his thoughts so effortlessly, as if he'd been granted a peek into Hannibal's mind. It was not the first time Will had surprised him with such an observation, but it was the first time that Hannibal felt curious about it. It was not coincidental. Once was a lucky guess. Twice was intriguing enough to make him want to know more. Yet Will looked so terribly uneasy that he decided against remarking on it. He was, after all, entirely uncommon, and there would no doubt be another opportunity for his sharp insight to make itself known again. "Nothing is broken," Hannibal decided, and slid his fingers through Will's tousled curls, gently searching the fragile dome of his skull, his fingers curving of their own accord around the contours of Will's little ears. "Did you strike your head?" "No, we weren't moving all that fast," Will said, blushing as Hannibal's long fingers brushed down his ears, stroked back through his hair once more, and then withdrew. He cringed when Hannibal pulled him to his feet, the leg he'd fallen on mightily sore. It was overshadowed, however, by the kernel of sympathy he felt for his haughty and proud husband. War changed people, Will knew, and the battles Hannibal had fought were etched into his memories forever, a wound that would not heal no matter how much time passed. It was a wound that begged Will's Omega nature to soothe it, and he struggled to fight down the urge, to fight his bond, to be the Omega that Hannibal desired, the Omega that his father had molded him to be. Absent.
"Gods forbid we had been,"
Hannibal said, aware of Will's solemn, thoughtful silence. He dragged the mess of saddle up and flung it to the side of the lane with the same suddenness that he dragged Will from his somber thoughts.
"You might have broken your neck."
"Neither of us is so lucky today, Lord Claudius," Will said, reminded again what Hannibal stood to gain from his loss. Hannibal dropped an uneasy, assessing look at him and pulled his stallion around. The panic he'd felt at seeing Will so helpless there in the road had abated somewhat, knowing he was not greatly harmed, but it was not gone entirely. Indeed, each time he pictured Will in such a state, it returned with no little insistence. Softly, thoughtfully, he said,
"That's a dismal thing to say, even for so surly a fellow as you."
Will shrugged, his smile tight and unhappy, turning to discomfort when Hannibal's hand slid around his waist. Before he could protest, he was hefted up into the stallion's saddle sideways. "You're going to walk to town? I didn't expect such chivalry from you, especially toward an Omega."
"Good, because I'm not being chivalrous,"
Hannibal said, taking the mare's reins and tying her to the stallion's saddle. He briefly crowded Will, grabbing hold of the pommel near his thigh, and looming into his space as he mounted up behind him.
"I'm not walking anywhere."
Will huffed with indignant irritation when he was hefted, tugged, and settled comfortably before him, legs slung to one side over Hannibal's thigh, his eyes wide, staring with outrage at the hand that rested on his own thigh to steady him. Hannibal clucked and the horse rolled into an easy walk, jostling Will enough that he reflexively put an arm around Hannibal's side to grip the back of the saddle. "This is entirely uncalled for," Will said, wishing he wasn't so warm than that his alpha's scent wasn't so deliciously compelling. It made him feel oddly overheated and lethargic, a curious malady indeed. He tried his best to sit erect, but it was nearly impossible, and he wound up leaning into Hannibal's chest, grumpy and sore. It galled him how even this affected him, rendering him nothing more than a touch-starved Omega, the very victim of instinct that Hannibal was so repulsed by.
"You're more sensible than most, Will."
"Most Omegas, you mean?"
"Most people. You realize there are very few options at hand just now,"
Hannibal said, spluttering a little when the wind tickled his nose with a handful of Will's silky curls. Grinning, he asked,
"Unless your head is full of the same fluff that tops it."
"Ah, finally!" Hannibal's brows rose at that, wondering at his soft chuckle.
"Insult to injury,"
Will said, tipping his head forward, taking those soft curls and sweet fragrances with him.
"But you aren't injured, remember,"
Hannibal said, unable to resist needling him. He was surprisingly heavier than he looked, solid and firm, with young muscle that sat tensely in Hannibal's lap.
"Goodness, you are very warm."
"I run hot, and stop squeezing me," Will warned him, tossing a dangerous glare up at him. Hannibal hadn't realized his hand had slipped from Will's leg to fold around his narrow waist. Feeling a little caught out, he said,
"We can't have you falling again, can we?"
"I didn't fall. I put great store in my riding, thank you very much. I no more fell from her back than you did."
"You do have an enviable seat, to be sure. You could handle a much more powerful mount. She's a fine little mare, she's a bit drab."
"I'm not interested in how she looks, thank you," Will said, affronted that his horse would be so insulted. "She has a soft mouth and a gentle gait, and she is very sturdy. I take her on rounds, and she never once fusses. You cannot say the same of your stallion, if you recall." Hannibal chuckled, impressed by his passionate defense of his mare, and conceded his point.
"No, he's a handful. Hardly got any bit of business done for minding him. But you are a Marquess, Will. You should have a horse that suits you."
"She suits me perfectly well," Will said, casting an affectionate glance back at her and smiling softly when her ears flicked. "She has been stalwart these past 6 years. She's never shied, even that morning when you—" He cut off, flushing to have so thoughtlessly brought up the morning he had bonded to his husband. Hannibal's amusement fled at the mention of that ride and how things had gone. He had not realized Will had formed such an attachment to that mare, but it made a certain poetic sense to him. When Will had been rejected and terrorized, she had carried him safely home without trouble. and had continued to do so since that day.
"I've a mind to have all your gear checked,"
Hannibal said, gruffly not acknowledging Will's slip when he was so obviously distressed by it.
"You might have sustained a terrible injury, Will. Even such a capable and loyal animal couldn't manage to unbuckle her own straps. There must be something wrong with the saddle."
"Yes," Will said, uneasy, the sudden spike in his tension making Hannibal's frown deepen.
"I'll get you something for pain at the druggist's."
"Please don't do that," Will said, refusing, forced harder into Hannibal's chest as they hit the slight hill that preceded Hartford town. "It is nothing."
"I won't have you limping around Bedelia's garden party, else they'll wonder what other carpets I've been tumbling you on."
Will didn't justify that with a response, other than to blush in mortification, doing his best to ignore the way his heart knocked in his chest, surely loud enough that Hannibal could hear it.
"You're coiled like a spring,"
Hannibal complained, shifting Will just slightly closer, enjoying the press of his warm, solid body enough that he needed to analyze it for a bit and figure it out. He was not prone to attraction to men, whatever their delicacy, so it couldn't be that, he knew. Fascination, maybe, with the unpredictable nature of such an intriguing and taciturn young man. "I cannot breathe," Will said. Hannibal noted he had breath enough to complain. "I'm capable of holding on."
"You'd rather fall face first into a dung pile than hold on to me, Will?"
Hannibal chuckled, allowing the horse his head. It picked up the pace, ears perked, and trotted lightly down the hill into town.
"I doubted it would improve your disposition."
"To the contrary. A dung pile is preferable to being squeezed in a press." Hannibal eased his grip, chastened by the way Will's complaint ended on a breathless growl. They passed the last stretch in silence, and Hannibal stopped for a moment at the end of town, just watching the village begin its day.
"Mr. Woodward said you liked to watch the town wake up,"
Hannibal mused, idly spreading his fingers over Will's thigh.
"Is this what you do?"
"Yes, I find it very calming," Will said, momentarily lost in his own comfortable habits. "There's something very relaxing about seeing the village rise, and it's nice to take some exercise after being in the office for those first few hours." Hannibal considered that, thinking of his own mornings spent waking next to one or another of his mistresses, enjoying the indulgence of servants waiting on them hand and foot, while Will was here, alone, watching the busy activity of a town he did not feel a part of, separated by a rank he never claimed. An outsider looking in, making a place for himself through earnest work that Hannibal had never dreamed an Omega could manage, let alone as successfully and impressively as Will had. He felt Will's fingers against his back, a light pressure that distracted him from his thoughts. Nudging the horse on down the main road, Hannibal broke his contemplative silence by asking,
"You truly do enjoy your work at Hartford House, Will?"
"Yes, it is important to be useful and do something worthwhile with one's time. It is consuming and rewarding work."
"Will, I do appreciate what you've managed here at Hartford House,"
Hannibal said, earning a startled furtive look from his spouse.
"You've managed to make improvements that I never expected or would have thought of. I may not have been made clear on that account towards you, but I am impressed by what you've accomplished."
Will absorbed that, unexpected as it was, but he could feel no lie through his bond to Hannibal, and he felt a blush stain his cheeks, the familiar impatience with praise rising in him thanks to his father's lessons.
"I do not intend for you to see me as uprooting your place here, Will,"
Hannibal said, turning his horse toward the town livery.
"The truth of the matter is, a child will require the full of our attention, and I know you would not wish the estate business to fall behind in the meantime. The best solution is to hire an estate manager fairly soon, so that you can instruct them on how things should be properly done. There is nothing to prevent you from taking over again once our son is old enough for school."
Will stayed silent. The rational business part of him understood Hannibal's position, but he couldn't help feeling stripped of his purpose. Being the Hartford estate manager was all he knew. He had never been educated about children. His father had never dreamed it would be an issue and had taught him to be useful with good reason.
"Useless things," his father had said, "are only fit for burning." "You there, boy,"
Hannibal called, getting the attention of a grubby little stable hand as they rode up.
"A half-mile up the road is a broken saddle. Fetch it and have your master fix it, and tend this mare for now."
"Yes, my lord," the boy said, darting to take her when Hannibal untied the reins. His shrewd little eyes flicked over at Will, and, at a loss, he said, "Morning, Mr. Graham." "Good morning, John," Will said, wearily aware that Hannibal was determined to be seen with him. Not that it mattered any more, if he was to hire an estate manager anyway. That aside, after their visit to Golden Meadow Farm and their other tenant farmers, news of his place had no doubt already made the rounds of Hartford town.
"Wondered where you were this morning."
"Greatly inconvenienced," Will said with no little heat. "Please see that my saddle is fixed and the mare is ready for my return trip."
"We can ride double if she isn't,"
Hannibal said, smirking when Will promptly said, "I am sure the weather will be nice enough for me to enjoy the walk, Lord Clarges." Chuckling, Hannibal turned the horse back towards the main road and drew to a halt at the dresser's, where he swiftly slid down and fixed the horse to a nearby post. "Ah, such a shame," Will said, relieved. "They aren't open."
"They will be,"
Hannibal said, seeing movement behind the glass. He reached up and caught Will by his slender waist to heft him down, asking,
"Does it hurt much?"
"No, I'm fine, and I tire of telling you so. Let's finish whatever mischief you're up to and be gone, shall we?" The mischief, much to Will's exasperation, was engaging Mr. Avery, the tailor, to flesh out his meagre wardrobe, and Hannibal took great pleasure in the way the staff all fawned over him, eager to please. It made Will snort with disdain from his seat, his untouched tea beside him and his arms folded over his chest, his opinions unasked after Hannibal declared him tetchy and viperish and entirely out of sorts.
"I will expect you to send off to your sister store in the capital for the quality I require,"
Hannibal said, rubbing his chin as he looked from one waistcoat to another, trying to decide which would suit Will best, as his mate had gruffly claimed to have no interest in any of it. The seafoam green with soft shell pattern would make his eyes seem all the lighter, but he was rather more partial to the royal blue, which he knew would both complement Will's coloring and make his eyes deeper in color.
"This is ridiculously difficult," he said, frowning between the two. "What do you think?"
"The royal blue is quite lovely," Mr. Avery commented, glancing at Will, "but the seafoam green is all the rage for omegas this year."
"The royal blue, then," Hannibal said, gesturing Will to stand. "I will not have any member of the Lecter family being trite."
"Perish the thought," Will breathed, reluctantly standing to be fitted for quick adjustments while Hannibal set about choosing his jacket and ordering a new pair of boots for him. "Honestly, Mr. Avery, is this entirely necessary? I've not changed all that much since last spring, surely?"
"Last spring?"
Hannibal echoed, pausing in his perusal to fix Will with an incredulous look, sparing Mr. Avery an answer. "I required a new riding coat," Will said, a touch defensive from his tone. "Nothing more. Mr. Avery, however, is very thorough, and takes measurements in their entirety, no matter one's haste."
"As well he should,"
Hannibal said, bringing a flush of pleasure to Mr. Avery's wan cheeks.
"And he will be seeing a great deal more of you, you can be sure. This appalling lack of wardrobe simply will not do. We must visit the Row in the capital before season starts and see you properly outfitted."
"You are so generous, Lord Clarges," he was told by the tailor's assistant, and nodded graciously that they had noticed. "Your son is so very lucky to have a father like you." Will's eyes rounded and he swallowed his laughter, almost undone by the horrified, bewildered expression on Hannibal's handsome face.
"Are you new here?"
Hannibal asked, cocking his head. Yes, my lord. Only just in from—"
"This is Will Graham,"
Hannibal said, pointing at Will.
"Yes, Mr. Graham."
"My spouse," Hannibal clarified. "Oh." The tailor's assistant went pasty pale and trembled, while Mr. Avery meekly stifled a smirk, knowing well enough who he was, and having been paid handsomely to keep his silence on the subject these many years.
"Good gods, man! How on earth would I have had a child his age when I'm not even 40?
Hannibal asked, thoroughly annoyed. "Why does everyone think he is something he is not?" "You do," Will said, earning himself a startled look that immediately fell into a dark scowl. He looks so young," the assistant said, a meek and diffident offering.
"And I so old?"
Hannibal inquired, a dangerous glint in his eye. "Of course not, Hannibal. Don't be petty," Will said, deciding to stop things before the poor man fainted dead away from embarrassment. He reached out without thinking, giving Hannibal's forearm a squeeze. Considering this is the first time anyone in the village has seen you in 6 years, you can hardly complain that some do not know that you were married to me." Hannibal gave the assistant a dark look, but the hand on his forearm distracted him from his anger, even brief as the touch was. Without even thinking, he corrected, "Are married." When he looked down at where Will's slender fingers lay on his arm, Will immediately dropped his hand and stepped away, embarrassed by his impulsive reaction. Slightly flustered, Hannibal reluctantly returned his attention to ordering things Will neither wanted nor needed, forgetting that it was all for the sake of public opinion when he imagined how pleasant it would be to see his spouse in something other than funeral black. To Will, it was an impressive waste of time, honestly, and he felt the first hour pass into the second with keen anxiety, wanting only to return to his little office and have some peace and quiet. Once word got around that Lord Clarges was in the dressers buying the place up for his spouse, the little shop got an unusual amount of activity, until it became quite crowded, and Will did his best to remain unobserved in his seat. Those in town who knew him by sight knew him only as the estate manager. Even those who knew him well enough to pass conversation with him had no idea he was the spouse that Hannibal had abandoned Hartford House to escape. Hannibal, however, made quite a show of charming the townsfolk, many of whom had never really made his acquaintance. The population had swelled significantly since Hannibal had left for the military, and the newcomers had only heard stories about their duke's heir, only knew what they read about in the society column of the capital newspapers. Will watched him, watched the effortless way he spoke, even to strangers, a teasing amusement that left them feeling flattered and singled out. He could be very charming when it suited him, though Will had never chanced to feel that charm turned on him with much effect. "Mr. Graham?" He turned to find a goodly portion of the female customers crowding the store were watching him, equal parts shy and excited.
"I do apologize, Mr. Graham, for not recognizing you before,"
he was told by Mrs. Kirkland, whose husband leased their most profitable grain fields.
"I was sure my husband was having me on when he said you were a proper marquess."
Will laughed softly, relieved that she and her bevy of plump farm wives seemed more pleased than aghast at his duplicity. "Mrs. Kirkland, I assure you my own father would hardly recognize me as a marquess. I'm afraid I was intent on deceiving you. I humbly beg your forgiveness." They tittered and exchanged glances like a group of schoolgirls, which coaxed a smile from him.
"You've always done right by us, Mr. Graham. We do hope things won't change much now that he's come back."
"Only in that I will no longer serve as estate manager, Mrs. Pembroke. For a time, at least. There are family matters which need tending."
"I've had my fill of them family matters, I own,"
Mrs. Kirkland confided, blushing at her own boldness.
"But I reckon it will be no chore, handsome as your marquess is."
"I will admit my husband's faults cannot be found in his looks, ladies," Will said, smiling at the assembled group. "He will certainly make some lucky woman very happy some day." There was a round of scandalized, amused gasps at laughter, good-natured, inclusive, as if finding out Will was Omegan granted him not just a place with their husbands' businesses, but also a place in their feminine circle. It was surprisingly pleasant to feel such camaraderie, even if their sense of propriety caused them to excuse themselves from too much socializing. Despite everything, Will was a marquess, thanks to his husband's status, and everyone knew that set him apart. He contented himself with simply staying out of the attention Hannibal drew, and amused himself watching how Hannibal controlled the room like a delighted puppet master. "Mr. Graham, I will have the breeches, waistcoat, and jacket all delivered before the end of the day," Mr. Avery said, awash now in good spirits at the sudden bustle of business in his little shop. "Have them given to Jimmy as usual," Will said, standing gingerly, glad when his weight did not overly bother his leg. "He will tend to my wardrobe." That earned him a trilling little laugh, and the tailor immediately turned his attention back to Hannibal, who kept casting meaningful looks his direction to beckon him closer. Will, however, had nearly had his fill of the crowded store, and headed towards Hannibal to tell him so when the door clanged noisily, and the buxom, dark-eyed widow Reynolds breezed in, scanning the room to find Hannibal. "Lord Clarges," she called, pushing through the polite press to reach him, her eyes alight with excitement and her formidable bosom heaving beneath her rather garishly colored red dress. "It's been too long." Will came to an abrupt halt at the sight of her snagging Hannibal by the arm and cozying up to him, rendered mute with shock at her gall, and embarrassment at her lack of discretion. Beatrix Danvers? Hannibal asked, placing her face at last. He tried to shake her off, but she clung like a damned barnacle, much to his consternation. What on earth are you doing here? It's Reynolds now. I'd heard you'd come home, she said, fluttering her lashes at him in a way she no doubt thought was becoming. I came as soon as I could to offer you my condolences. Condolences? Hannibal echoed, frowning down at the samples he was attempting to choose from, and wishing Will would come join him. And who has died? She uttered a shrill little laugh and squeezed his arm, breathing. You know. Hannibal glanced at her, ready to tell her that he bloody well did not know, but he spied Will staring at him and got distracted by the strange, assessing look on his face. It was concerning enough that he began to step towards him, but Beatrix held fast, whispering to him, Your marriage, Lord Clarges. I know that you are away from your mistress for some time here at Hartford House, and I've come to remind you that I am a widow for many years, and very much available to offer you comfort when you need it. How odd, Hannibal remarked, tipping his face close to her ear to keep his words private, as I find myself more discomfited now than I was before your arrival. He smirked, pleased with himself, and looked up to see Will's blue eyes on the pair of them, half-lidded and glittering, his mouth tight with disapproval. It made Hannibal aware that everyone in the dressers was staring at him with varying shades of that same disapproval, for all the world seeing him standing with an old lover on his arm and trading whispered banter with her right in front of his silent, still spouse. He could almost see the gossip starting, destroying everything he'd hoped to accomplish. Annoyed, he removed Beatrix from his arm and shortly ordered, Will, please join me. I am in need of your opinion. Very calmly, his voice never rising above a soft, sultry purr, Will said, My opinion is that red is a colour which suits you immensely, Lord Clarges. You wear it with the ease of long familiarity. If you will excuse me, I am much too busy to indulge your whims at the moment. Hannibal gaped at him, as did the rest of the shop, including Beatrix. With that shocking statement made, Hannibal's uncommon mate turned on his heel and marched out of the shop with the same stiff-backed dignity of a soldier off to war, leaving Hannibal staring after him. Goodness gracious, Lord Clarges, is that your spouse? Beatrix asked, a flush of embarrassment finally lighting her cheeks. Yes, Hannibal said, watching Will leave the shop with a soft, admiring smile on his face. He absolutely is.